In this webinar today, we'll be demonstrating numerous tips and tricks allowing you to tap into the full potential of rendering with RenderZone. RenderZone is a plugin for FormZ which extends the existing visualization and rendering capabilities with all sorts of additional tools to assist you with anything from simple scene development to your most demanding rendering needs. And these techniques can be implemented into any scene, from architectural interiors, exteriors, product design, graphic visualizations, and more. We'll be reviewing a number of how do I questions asked by our users over the years, giving you the skills necessary to create stunning images like the ones you see by our users. Questions such as, how do I create a standard light setup for any scene? How do I create softer lighting effects? How do I control shadows and reflective surfaces? How do I create perforated metal and transparent decals? And much more. So with that, let's begin with our first question, which is, how do I create a light setup for any scene? Well, there's a few different methods that we'll be looking at today. The first one is just add more lights. And a couple of key things that we'll have to keep in mind is that as we add more lights into the scene, we will have to reduce the intensities, and we can also turn off shadows for certain light sources to control the shadow effects in that scene. So before we start adding more lights, let's look at some of the characteristics of how the lights behave in your scene. The first thing we'll look at is the distant light source. And you can see that every scene that you start has a distant sunlight, and we can move the arrow, and as we change that arrow, we're changing the direction of that light source. Now this light source does infinitely extend throughout the entire scene. So we change the direction of the arrow, we're changing the direction of that light source. If we move the entire light itself, we are not changing how the light is interacting in your scene. So you can see I can place this sunlight source 100 miles away from the scene, and it will render exactly the same. I can place it underneath our scene, and you can see nothing has changed with the actual lighting. So keep in mind that with the sunlight, it's not important where the light is positioned. What's important is the angle of that sunlight or distant light source. Now, another way that we can move that light source is to go into the palettes. There's a sun position palette, and inside of here, you can see we can actually choose the time of day, and that'll move that sunlight for us. It's automatically animated. We just click the play button. We can choose any day of the year and choose any city throughout the entire world and automatically position that sunlight for us there. All right, so now that we know the characteristics of that distant light source, let's start adding more lights into our scene. Now we're going to move to a different scene here. Here we have an object with just a single light source there that is positioned there. And in order to add additional light sources, one way to do that is we can go into the rendering and animation workspace, and there's a set of tools that allow us to place lights in the scene. So let's select the distant light. And as soon as I place it in the scene, you can see we're beginning to really saturate that scene with a lot of additional light. Okay. Now actually what I'm going to do, I have a few lights that are already placed in here. So if I go down to my lights palette, you can see that I've added another light over on this side over here. So when I turn that on, we're getting some additional light to fill in this area here. And also notice that I have the shadow option turned off. Now if I have the shadow option on, we're getting shadows from that light source also, or I can turn the shadow option off of that light source, so we're only adding additional light to sort of fill in light in that part of the scene without casting additional shadows into the scene. All right, now something that happens as we add more and more lights, I'll spin this around, and you can see that the back side is pretty dark because we don't have any light sources that are projecting into the back of our scene. So I'll add another light source back here to sort of fill in this area. So let me turn that on. And then I added another light source over here. And notice that I have this one pointing up. So you can see that I can actually fill the bottom. So light's coming into the bottom of the object here. And then when I turn that on, you can see we're actually projecting light on the bottom side of there. So really, it's up to you to decide where to add these additional light sources in the scene. But keep in mind, you can turn the shadow option off. And also, if you look at the intensities that are there, you definitely have to reduce the intensities of those additional light sources, because all those light sources will add together, and you don't want to oversaturate that scene. All right. Now, another way of adding additional or creating a standard light setup would be to add an atmospheric light. So this is the second method that we will look at. Now instead of adding a bunch of lights, we're just going to add one light, and that one light will be an atmospheric light. And once again, we do have to control the intensities as we're adding that additional light into the scene. And we can also turn the shadows off so that the light will penetrate through the ceiling and the walls and fill in that area of our space, whether it's an interior or a exterior scene. All right, so let's try that. Let's look at a sample file for that. So here we go. We have one distant light in our scene. It's shining through the windows over here on the side. So let's go into a front view here, and I'll click the RenderZone button, and you can see that the light is coming in through the glass, but once it hits the floor, it doesn't bounce. So we get no lighting coming into the ceiling and the walls and things like that. So one thing we can try is we can go to the sunlight here, double click on it, let's look at the options here, just keep cranking up that light source, make it brighter and brighter, and you see it really doesn't have much of an effect on the scene other than making the hotspot over the lights coming in a lot brighter. Okay, so in order to emulate the light that's going to sort of fill in this space, what we can do is add one more light source to our scene. So with that, I'll click the green plus button over here, and I'm going to give this a name. Let's see, atmospheric. There we go. And you can name it anything that you want. Now when I double click on that, here's what we're going to set for this. This is a sunlight. So you see the default when you add a new light to the scene, it's a distant sun. So now we have two suns in our scene, but I don't want to have any brightness coming from that sun source itself. So I'm going to turn this to the minimum possible value. So I'm going to set that to 0 or 1%. So there's no light coming from that sun source. There'll be no shadows that is created from this light source, so it'll go through walls and ceilings and things like that. So where's the light coming from? Well, if I click on the parameters tab, you can see I can turn on the atmospheric light option. And so this intensity value is going to control the amount of light that's coming from the atmospheric light. And the atmospheric light is like a dome that's around your entire scene, so it's coming from everywhere. And that's why we can use this option to sort of fill in light inside of that scene. We click OK, render. And when we render it, now you see we're starting to fill in a lot of additional light into that space. Okay. Now, something else we can do is to add a little more contrast here. We're not done yet. We still got a couple more steps here. And you can see that to build a little more contrast here, we can go into the global illumination settings, and we can add some ambient occlusion, some final gather to actually make the light truly bounce inside of that scene. So let's take a look at that. Those settings are found in the display options. You can hit the F9 key and access those. And you click on the global illumination tab. So make sure you get the RenderZone option selected here. And you have global illumination, turn on ambient occlusion. All you have to do is give it your scene size. So this is just a room. And I'm going to set the quality to low so it renders really fast. And for your final rendering, you can crank that up higher if you need. Now the important parameter for the ambient occlusion effect is this distance. And this distance will determine how far the darkness, as the light is being subtracted from the corners of where two surfaces meet, it'll be controlling how dark those areas get. Okay, we can even make those a lot darker if we want to. There's this additional contrast to make those areas darker if we want. So just by turning on the ambient occlusion effect only, I'm going to click the update button to re-render the scene, and notice now we're getting light subtracted where the wall hits the ceiling up here, and all these little recessed details that are in here, and it just makes a lot of those details pop in our scene. All right, now in this case, the RenderZone rendering is not bouncing light in the scene yet. We're filling in light by that one atmospheric light, but inside the global illumination options, we can also turn on final gather. What the final gather does is it will bounce light in that scene. Okay, so if we click update, we can see we can render it again. Now it's going to start to calculate how light's going to bounce around in that scene. And there's a couple of parameters that we can adjust with that. Let's go ahead and look at those. If we go into the global illumination, final gather, we can do the scaled output. So right now it just bounces whatever light's in there at the same value. So I can actually exaggerate this a little bit. As I turn the scale output up, we're actually forcing more light to bounce off the surfaces that are there. Also, the color saturation, as the light's bouncing, it'll pick up the color of the face or surface or object that it's bouncing off of, and we can actually increase or exaggerate the amount of color bleeding as that light is bouncing off the surfaces that are there. And just turn that up just a little bit, because a little goes a long way, because as you turn that up, it really starts to really bleed the colors into the scene. So just by setting those options there, I click the update button, and now you can see we're getting a lot more light in the scene because we're scaling that light up a little bit to have more of it bounce. We're also getting some color bleeding, so it's picking up the color of the wood floor, and that's starting to pull into the scene here. So anyways, that's pretty much one way. You can actually increase the light a little more if you want to be able to force more light into that scene if we need. But let's look at a third method that we can use, and this is using an HDRI light source. All right, so that stands for High Dynamic Range Image. You can use the environment light type to create a HDRI light source in your scene. And once again, we'll probably want to turn off the shadow so light will penetrate through walls and ceilings. So there's quite a few different types of HDRI images that you can use. This is an image that is captured by a camera, and it records not just the image but also the light intensity values. And so it has the color data plus the light values for each of the pixels there. So you can actually use this as an actual light source. So you can light your entire scene with one single HDRI image. So let's see how that works. We're going to use the same scene, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off this atmospheric light, and I'm going to add another light source, and let's call this HDRI so I can keep track of these. All right, I double click on that, and you can see right now when I create a new light source, by clicking the plus button here, it automatically makes it a distant light. We don't want another sunlight. What we want is a environment light. All right. And then with that, what we can do is go to the parameters tab over here, and we can load an HDRI image. We can load a cubic or spherical. If you use the cubic option, then of course you can see here we got the 6 individual images, or you have the single cross image like we showed in that slideshow image. If you use the spherical option, then you have the option to either use the panoramic or the spherical format here. Okay, so I'm going to load that HDRI image, and here I have one called rnlprobe.hdr. And I probably should mention too, you don't even have to use an actual HDRI image. Those are great because it already has the true light intensity values in there, but you can actually load any type of pixel image, and it'll use both the color and based on the intensity value, it'll use the intensity of the pixels. And so you can still use non-HDRI images for this also. But anyways, you can see here someone has captured the scene, and so we have the color and light data here. All right, so with that, we can also boost up the intensity a little bit if we want to. I find myself, the 100% is going to use the actual light values, but I find myself very often when I'm using HDRI images, I like to boost that brightness up even more to exaggerate that, just to flood the scene and with a lot more light. But you'll have to play with that value yourself. We do want to have the shadow option off, so the light will pass through the walls and ceilings and things like that. And that's it. So you can see all we did was add this one additional light source here. I click the RenderZone button, and off it goes. And now you can see that we're actually getting a lot of light flooded into the scene here. The ambient occlusion is giving our darkening and our contrast here. Final gather is bouncing the light. Our HDRI image is just putting light everywhere because we have the shadow option off. So it'll hit every surface in there. And the light that we see down here is just from our one sunlight that's there. So anyways, there you go. So there's another method for being able to have a standard light setup for your scene. And one of them we get very often is, how do I create softer lighting effects? And the big key ingredient for that is fall off. And so make sure you have your light source set to a linear clamped fall off. And if you have like a point light, the fall off will be determined by the radius value. And if you have a cone or a projector light, then the fall off will be determined by the distance of the arrow of that cone light source. So let's take a quick look at that. All right, here's a scene where we have this wall with a couple light fixtures there. So let's add some lights here. Let's put a point light on this fixture right here. So let's zoom into that. Select the point light tool, and I'll just simply snap it right on to the end there. All right, let's add a cone light over here. So let's go to the cone light source, and I'm going to snap it right to the end of the fixture there. There it is right there. Okay. All right, so there's our default setup. And if I were to render it right now without changing anything, I just click the RenderZone button. You can see we get some very saturated light sources, very hard edges there. And in order to soften that up a little bit, there's a couple really quick, easy techniques we can use to do that. Okay, first, if you look at the point light that's here, I'm going to go into shaded full mode. Now, the shaded full is not a rendering mode. Well, it's not a RenderZone ray trace rendering mode. It's just sort of a preview mode, so we're not going to get the full accurate lighting effects until we click the RenderZone button. But it gives us a good approximation, which will help us out. So, for example, I can right-click on that point light, show controls, and that gives us the radius. The radius will determine the rate of fall off of that light source. And so you can see here, I'm not changing the intensity. The brightness of the light stays the same. What changes is how fast that light falls off. So the faster, the smaller radius you have, the quicker the light will fall off. Okay. Now also notice when you have that light picked, you do have options in the tool options over here. Go to parameters. Here's all the light parameters here. So you can either double click it in the lights palette, or if you have it selected, all the options are here in tool options. And you can see that, make sure you have the fall off set to linear clamped, and then here's the radius value. And so if I set that to, for example, 2 feet, that means that light will get half as bright every 2 feet. And so we can sort of control the fall off of that light source. Now we're not seeing the full effect in the shade of full mode until we actually render that. So we'll do that in just a second. But before we do that, let's modify the fall off of a cone light. With that, if I were to select that, I can right click and show controls. As I said, the fall off, you can see here it's set to linear clamp, so it is falling off. If you set that to constant, then there's no fall off. It's the same intensity forever. It'll keep shining for 100 miles. Whereas here we'll set that to linear clamp. And the fall off, there is no radius option here. What we have to do is control the distance of this arrow. This is the origin of light. This is the center of interest of that light. And you can see if I were to drag that up, that we can actually shorten that arrow. We're not changing the cone. The cone is the same radius angle. We're just shortening that arrow so that the fall off distance will be a lot faster. So it'll fall off to half the distance, or half the brightness based on the distance of that right there. Now, one thing I like to do too, these cone lights, especially if they're on a wall like this, is I like to sort of push them towards that wall, because what will happen with that is it'll actually force it to project on that wall a little more like that. Okay. Now, another thing about the fall off would be this inner and outer angle. So you can see this is the outer angle, and this arrow will determine the inner angle. And you see, this is the hotspot area of that light. And if you get a greater distance between the inner and outer angle, you have a greater area for that light to fall off. And you can see that the inner and outer angles are set right here also, so you can actually go in and type in numbers or drag these sliders back and forth. And the more difference you have, the greater the gap between those two, the softer that light will be, because there's more area for that light to fall off. Okay, so there, with that, click on the RenderZone button, render the scene, and now we've taken those very hard lights and sort of softened those up a little bit so that we get a nice little soft lighting effect like we see here. Okay, all right, so let's look at some other questions that we get quite often. We get a question that says, how do I create soffit lighting? And so you sort of have sort of a string of lights, or sort of fluorescent tubes, or some kind of long linear light fixture that has light. So it's not like a point light, or it's not like a cone light that's like a flashlight. It's not like the sun. It's just sort of, you need some kind of long distant type light. And one of the many ways of doing that, there's a few different ways. One of the most common ways is using a line light source. So let's see how that's done. So let's go into the same scene that we have here, but this time we're going to put some soffit lighting back here. And we have a light that is behind this wood panel that we have, and if this is already set up for us, so I click the RenderZone button, you can see we're getting light that's sort of splashing back against the brick wall, and also notice it's coming onto the floor. So this is an actual light source. This isn't just some kind of glow effect here. Okay, so how was that created? Well, we're going to show you. So what we did is, if I go in and let's turn off this little wood panel here. And I'm going to turn off the light that's already there. So let's make that visible. There we go. So that's the visibility. That's the on-off switch. All right. And all I did was create a line. And this line can be any type of vector line. You can actually use the derivative tools to derive a line off that wood object that was there, or just sort of freely draw a vector line or any type of line shape. So that is just a standard geometry vector line. And with that line, you select the line light tool, you click on it, and now that line becomes a light source. A light will radiate from the entire linear distance of that line. Now, The rings here are representing the fall off range. So we go to the tool options over here, and you can see that we can set values such as the fall off is going to be linear clamped. Here's a radius value. So if I set that to 3 inches, then you can see that the radius is 3 inches. That means every 3 inches that light will fall off to half of its brightness value. Okay, and one little tip that you want to know here is that with line lights, because it's trying to distribute that intensity across the entire length of that line, as the lines get sort of long, you're going to have to crank up the brightness value. And so 100% is not going to work in the scene. You're going to have to really crank that thing up and set it to, perhaps even 4,000% to be able to really force the light to come off of that line light. Okay, so that's just a little tip for you to sort of understand why sometimes if you use a line light, you're not seeing any light. Just start cranking up that brightness, because it has to uniformly radiate in all different directions across the entire linear length that is there. Okay. All right. One of the other questions we get very often is, how do I control shadows? And there's basically 2 different types of shadows that you can create within Form Z RenderZone. One of them is soft mapped, which gives you a softness slider, so you can sort of make them warm and fuzzy shadows. We also have hard ray trace shadows, and so they're very crisp hard ray trace shadows. However, it does have the option to be able to make them transparent. So you can see here we have sort of the blue glass is sort of creating true transparent shadows from that. And we also have cast shadow attributes that can be assigned, so we can have light pass through objects, and you can turn the shadow option off for the lights, as we saw in the previous example also. So there's all sorts of little variables here, little knobs that we can play with here to have total control of how the shadows are going to look in our scene. So let's take a look at that. All right. So here's our basic setup. So we have a glass wall here with some mullions in there, and just with the default setup, you would normally get something that looks like this. I click the RenderZone button, and there we go. So we have no transparency for the glass. We get dark shadows back here. So let's start looking at the different ways that we can control the shadow effects. Okay. First thing we want to do is assign some transparency for the glass, right? So let's do that. If I were to select that, I actually want to pick all of these. So neat little features. I can just right click and say, pick all objects that have the same material, and it can automatically find all those other objects for me. All right, here's the material assigned to that. I double click. One way of creating glass, we're gonna look at some other ways of doing this. One way is just to set the transparency to be center edge. And the advantage of this is that you have a different transparency level for the outside edge and the center of that object. And I'm going to leave it at the default settings here, but you can see that gradient transparency is going to give it more of a realistic effect. All right, so just by changing that, I'm going to click the RenderZone button, and we have transparency. We can see through it, but we're still getting these very dark, opaque shadows. Okay. Now, what we can do with that is we can actually go into the option here to be able to let light pass through those. As I mentioned, there's a cast shadow attribute that you can assign for objects. So what I can do is let light pass through by leaving the shadow option on. I don't want to turn the shadow option off for the light, because then you won't see any shadow. So I need to have the shadow option on for the light source to see that. So what I can do is, if I were to select that glass object, next I'm going to select all of the objects that have the same material. And you notice in the tool options over here, there's an attribute for that object, or all the objects that I have selected. That's cast shadows. So if I turn that off, that object will not cast shadows, so light will be allowed to pass through that object. So now if I click the render zone, here we go, it renders, and now we get light passing through. We get the shadow from the mullions only, and it's passing through the glass panels. Now here's a tip that you need to know, is that whenever you're using soft shadows, we'll see that the default here, if I go into the sunlight that we have set here, if I go and double click and click the shadows option, you can see that right now it's set to a soft mapped shadow. Whenever you're using soft mapped shadows, one thing that you have to do is you have to go into any large ground planes, so very large terrains or floors or any type of large ground plane type object. What you want to do is turn the cast shadow attribute off for that also. Okay, now as soon as I do that, you'll notice that when I render this again, we get a lot crisper, higher quality soft shadows. Okay, and you can read that in the manual if you want, if you dig through all those pages, but I'm actually telling you now, so that'll fix up your soft shadows whenever they don't look right. So by turning the cast shadow attribute off for any large ground planes. All right, now The advantage of the soft shadows is we can do this. I can go back into the sunlight. I double click on it. Here's a shadow option, soft mapped. We have this nice little softness option, so I can crank it up and make those shadows a lot more fuzzy if I want. So I can crank it up a little bit, maybe 10-15%, I don't know, for this scene here. And there we go. And now if I were to render the scene again, we can take that shadow and actually have it more fuzzy. It sort of blurs it out a little bit. Okay. Now if you, let me give you another little tip here. If you're in the shadow option, if you start to crank that up really high, you really get very spread out, blurry type shadows. Sometimes you get some artifacts where the blurry shadows will creep up other objects and things like that. And so if you crank this up pretty high, you might want to bring that tolerance up just a little bit. Always have that way below what this is set to, but bring that up a little bit, and it's a little cleanup routine that'll try to clean up any artifacts that might be generated from the soft shadows by cranking up the softness very high. Okay. All right, so that is soft shadows. What about hard ray trace shadows? Let's take a look at that. I double click. Let's change this from the shadow option to a hard ray traced. And notice that all the softness options are now ghosted. So the hard ray tracing has no softness options for that. But it does have a transparent option, which is not available with the soft mapped. So if I turn that on, we can actually truly generate transparent shadows or colored shadows through objects. So let's render the scene. And let's see what happens. Well, I don't see any colored shadows here is because we have the cast shadow attribute off for this glass object. So if we're going to be using hard ray trace transparent shadows, we're probably going to want to leave the cast shadow option for these objects. So let's select all those glass objects, turn on the cast shadow for those glass objects there. Click RenderZone, and now with the hard ray trace transparency, the color of the light, the color of the glass or transparency it's going through, the color of the wall it's hitting, whatever, it'll mix all that properly to give you true transparent shadows. Okay, so there's a lot of things to sort of play with to have control of your shadows in your scene. Okay. Now, one more thing we might want to do to sort of finish this off is add some reflectivity for the mullions and the glass and things like that. So before we do that, before we add it to here, let's maybe look at some of the things that we can do to control reflectivity in our scene. So let's go over here. And actually, there's many ways of creating reflective objects in Form Z RenderZone. We're going to look at 3 of the most common ways that you can control reflectivity in your scene. One of them is using the mirror shader. There's an environment shader, and there's also a metal shader. Okay, so let's take a look at those first, and then we'll apply that to our glass wall that we have there. All right, so let's look at a little sample file here and click the RenderZone button. And there we go, different types of reflectivity. One of them is mirror, very highly polished mirror that we have here, very crisp reflections in there. The environment gives us the additional ability to sort of put a little fuzz or blur factor into the reflections that are in there. And the metal allows us to not only have reflections, but also absorption and refraction index settings for different types of materials. So it'll actually reflect like the actual material, whether it's gold or aluminum or bronze or brass or whatever. So let's take a real quick look at that. Let's begin by taking a look at the mirror type reflection shader. So if you want something to be reflective, I double click on the material, and all you have to do is I'm going to leave the color to be white, and in the reflection option I set that to mirror. And when I set that to the mirror option, I click the options button. It gives me all the mirror options. Now here's the important things to understand here. This is the reflectivity off that surface. By default, it's cranked up pretty high. We can look at the little preview window here. Now as I turn that reflectivity down, you'll notice that that surface gets darker and darker because we're getting less reflection on that surface. Okay. Now as we turn the reflectivity down, we then need to turn the diffuse reflection up. So it brings up the color of the object. The diffuse reflection is the color of the object itself, in which we have it set to white right now. It could be a texture or anything else. So as we bring up the color of the object, now we have more of a subtle reflection on there by turning that down, but the diffuse has to go up. So think of those 2 parameters as inversely proportional to each other. Now, one other tip you might want to know is that you cannot set the reflectivity below 12% or else you will not see reflections on the surface. That's what the basic default setup. If you want reflections that are less than 12, then you have to go into some other settings to make that happen. And actually that's a little bit beyond here. So if you do want that case, maybe at the end I can actually show that. But at this point here, let's go ahead and click OK and render the scene. And now you can see that we've reduced the reflectivity, we've boosted up the diffuse, and now we get less of a mirror type surface and more of a shiny, slightly reflective white plastic, perhaps. Okay, but also notice that the mirror option has no option in there to control the fuzziness or blurriness of the reflection on there. So you're always going to get a good, clean, crisp reflection on there. Okay, so that brings us to the next one, which is the environment shader. Okay, so let's take a look at that one. So this is the material that's assigned to the second sphere, and you can see here we have a white color, and the reflection is set to environment. And if you look at the options for that, we have the same reflectivity slider and the same diffuse slider, so it behaves just like the mirror, but we have this extra option here, which is the fuzz factor. So I turn this down, we get a very sharp ray traced mirror reflection, so it looks almost like the other one. If I crank this up high, I can actually crank it up really high. We get very fuzzy, blurry type reflections on there. It looks a little more glossy. Okay, and so here we have that added control to sort of fuzz the reflections that are in there. So I'll click OK, render that, and I think you'll see the difference between the sharpness of the reflections using the environment reflection shader. Okay, now another one that's commonly used is the metal reflection shader, and actually it's called metal accurate. So here's the one that's assigned to that. It's a white color object, but yet when we assign the metal accurate reflection shader to that, you can see in the options here we have the same reflectivity and diffuse, but we also have this refraction and absorption values here that we can assign. Now you can look up in a physics handbook for the type of metal or material that you're actually using, or just click the little button here and you can see that there's all sorts of predefined materials that are already set up for you. So I click gold. You can see that those refraction absorption indexes are already set for us, and you can see that we're actually getting a gold looking type of material. Even though the material is white, the type of reflection that's coming off of it is going to be characteristic of a gold type of material. Okay, and that's how you can recreate a lot of common type of metals by not trying to recreate the color of it, but just use the metal accurate reflection to be able to recreate that. Okay. So with that, now that we have a basic knowledge of the reflections, we can actually go back to the scene that we did earlier and add some reflections for this. Okay. Now, for the glass, actually, we can go in and look at the material that was assigned for that, and we went in and we can still use the center edge transparency, but we chose the environment shader, and of course we set the reflectivity slightly so it's not like a very highly reflective type surface. Got a little fuzz factor in there, so it looks like not like dirty windows, but maybe not such a sharp reflection in those windows that are there. Since the reflection is so high, we did have to turn the diffuse up to bring out more color of that object. And the same thing with the chrome for the mullions. We have a white color, but yet we're going to use the environment option here and set the reflection diffuse values appropriately. Put a little fuzz in there too, so they're not like very shiny reflections, but put a little fuzz in there. Okay. Okay. Now, one thing I should mention here, which I forgot to mention with the previous one there, is how did we get this additional reflections showing up inside of here? You know, right now we can see the red letters showing up on there, but where's all this other background stuff coming from? And this is actually coming from the environment map option. So if you go into your display options, and if you look at the scene tab here, you can see that there's a environment option. Normally this is off. And if I turn that off and render the scene, you'll see that we're getting just some very plain looking objects. By turning this on, we can actually have an image map that's mapped around the scene that can force additional reflections onto those objects that are there. We can use cubic or spherical type options. So let's use a cubic. Click on the options button, and we can load some pixel images. This makes a box around the scene. You don't see the box, but any reflective material will show these images on that surface as if that was a box that was actually in your scene. So you can load any type of image that you want. And another option we need to control is what's the size of the box, or what's the size of the sphere of the image if we use the spherical option. Well, that's set right here in the center and size option. You click that. By default, it's set to the infinite option, but if I choose fixed, I can give it the size of the box, I can center it in the scene, I can give it the size right here, and that controls how this environment image map box is placed inside of the scene. And that's how we get these additional reflections on the objects beyond just what the objects are in the scene. Okay, so that's what we did back here with this one. we actually went in. If you look at the RenderZone options here, scene, cubic, and we got this environment map. And here, instead of loading the picture of the default environment, we actually went to the site. We took a picture of the buildings that are across the street from the building that we're working on. We load that up, and now you can see that if I were to render this, the environment map is causing the reflections of that building across the street to show up not only in the glass but also on the chrome and things like that. So hopefully that'll give you a little more helpful information to be able to apply and have control over reflections and shadows in your scene. All right, another question we get is, how do I create perforated metal and mesh type of materials without actually creating complex geometry? You don't want to take an object and Boolean difference out 1,000 holes in order to create a perforated plate. So these can be created really easily using just materials with transparent maps and transparency effects assigned to those to be able to recreate those, okay? And you can have light pass through those also. And so this is an object that does not have any holes punched in it, but when you render it, you see light is passing through and casting shadows and things like that. So let's see how that's done. All right, well, here is a simple little surface or a wall or whatever. And we render that out, and it's a solid white opaque color. And we want that to look like perforated metal. And see, we get a nice little dark shadow back here. All right, so let's see how that's done. Well, if I double click on the material, you can see that in the material libraries, we just happen to have a whole series of meshes here. So I click on that. We have meshes and perforated plate, things like that. I'm going to choose this one right here, drag and drop it onto my material, and you can see all this is a white color. It's using a metal type of reflection. We can use any of the reflections that we just looked at. We can use mirror, the environment, any of those. The important one here is the transparency. So the transparency is a transparency map, and that automatically loaded this black and white image. So you can create any type of mesh pattern by having a black and white image of it. And so light will pass through the areas that are black, and you'll see the areas that are actually white. Or you can actually invert that if you want also. Okay. Now you don't have to have a black and white image. If you have a color image, then it'll use the intensity of the pixel colors that are there. But in other words, it's using grayscale information to control the level of transparency by just using a image map. So there, that's it. That's how easy these things work. So there. That's assigned. You click the RenderZone button, and there it is. We have these transparent dots that the light will pass through. Now, to keep in mind, in order to get the true transparent shadow here, you can only use hard ray traced transparent shadows. That's what we looked at previously. The soft map shadows do not have a transparent option, so you'll see a solid black shadow here. So if you are using these types of materials, the only way to truly see the transparent shadows is with hard ray traced transparent shadow effects. Okay. All right, one more thing we'll look at is how do I create transparent decals or glass accurate materials, and also control where it is on that object and how it only shows up on certain faces. We always get these questions all the time where they're trying to put a decal on something and it's showing up on multiple faces and they can't get the background to disappear and things like that. And so here we'll do a quick little walkthrough to see how that is done. Okay, so we will begin by looking at a simple wall that we have here. Let's go and click the RenderZone button, and it's just a solid white wall. All right. So first thing we want to do is make that wall look like glass. Now we could use the glass we used with that other wall, which used the center edge transparency with a reflection to it. But we're going to do something different here. We're going to use the actual glass accurate option. Okay, now this is found in the reflection options here. Now, if you assign glass accurate as a reflection shader, do not put a transparency to it. The transparency is already built into it. Okay, so we choose the glass accurate options. We click the options button, and you can see that there's a transmission slider which controls how transparent that glass accurate material is. So don't assign a separate transparency shader to it. But you can see we have the reflectivity of the surface, and we got the diffuse. So this is going to behave just like the previous reflections that we looked at with all of the other ones, with the only added benefit that we do have with transparency. Now here's another new one that's in the glass accurate, and this is only in the glass accurate, is the index of refraction. So light will actually bend as it goes through the thickness of that solid object. So if you look at a crystal ball or a thick glass vase, when you're looking to the background looks like it's shifted or distorted because of that refracting light. And this can only this works best on solid objects because the light has to come in and it also has to pop out the other side. So if you have a surface object, the glass accurate may not look all that great. So for the glass accurate to have its full effect, you really need to apply that to solid objects that have some thickness to it. Now, the index of refraction can be set using the material library that we have right here, or you can look up in any physics handbook and type in the refraction value that you want. Now, refraction of 1 means light will pass straight through. It won't bend at all. It's just set up to 1.1, 1.2, 1.4. The higher you set that up, the more light will bend and distort as it goes through that object. But notice I didn't change anything here. I'm leaving everything at the default settings. I have the color set to white. I render the scene, and now we have some pretty good looking glass. And it does take care of like the edges and things like that. Just I don't know how it does it. It just works. And also the reflections coming up on there, we do have an environment map set up for that. So go to the scene. We have a spherical. We have that image loaded that is now spherically mapped around the scene to get those nice reflections on there. All right, so that gives us our glass, but now we want a transparent logo decal across the front here. So how do we do that? Well, let's go to our materials. Let's create the material first that we want to place on there. So if I were to double click, I've already created this, but I'll just show you what was done. We actually went into the color map options and we loaded a pixel image. Here's the Form Z logo image, okay? And that's it. As for the transparency, we loaded a transparency map. Well, we chose the transparent map options. When the options button, we clicked on the match color shader. So if I click the match color shader, it loads the same image that was used that I loaded here. Or you can load a different one if you want, but in this case, I want the same one. And you can see that if there's an alpha channel assigned to that, you can make the background so it is transparent. So you can turn this option on, and now you can see the alpha channel information is then clipped out of that. So of course you will have to have the alpha channel information assigned to the image before you bring it into Form Z. So there, now we have a transparent image with a transparent background, and we see just the logo itself. Now how do we get that onto this object here? Well, we already have the glass assigned to that, so we have to assign more materials on top of the material that's already there. And the only way to do that is using the decal tool. And so with that, where do you find the decal tool? Well, it's in the rendering and animation workspace, so you have to click on that, and that's located right over here. That tool is located there. Now, another way to get access to this tool is if you hit the space bar, it brings up the favorites panel, just start typing in decal, and you'll see that everything that starts with D and type E, everything starts with DE shows up, and you can see the decal tool can be accessed there too. So hit the space bar, hit the D key, and there it is right there. Okay, and with that tool active, I click on my object, and it brings up this little decal dialog, which lets us control how additional materials can be placed on there. Click the green plus button, and we're going to add another decal sticker. What's the one that we want to add on here? Well, that's this lower left-hand corner. I can set the material to be whatever I want. So let's choose this material. All right. Now, in order to see it placed on that object, I'm going to turn on the Draw Tiles option. So it'll show me a blue rectangle of how that decal is going to be placed on that object. And then we use this little widget here to rotate it and move it around where we want. There's these guide snaps that help line that thing up. Now, what's the size of this? The size is determined over here and how it's projected on there. One thing I'm probably going to want to do, since this is an image map that has a certain pixel ratio assigned to that, I'm going to click this little arrow here next to the proportions option and say lock the horizontal and vertical size to match whatever the color map proportions are. And now the horizontal and vertical are now locked together. So if I change the horizontal, let's make that 16 feet, you can see that the vertical automatically updates also. So it maintains the proper ratio of the image, so you don't get any stretching or distorting of that image. At that point, now it's just a matter of moving this thing around and adjusting where you want it on that object, bring it up and down wherever we need. Now, if I RenderZone render this, I'm going to do a preview here. If I click the RenderZone button here, this is giving a preview only, so it's going to be a lower quality version. I won't see the full quality until I get into the modeling window here. But also notice that it's being projected on the front and the back face of that object. I don't want to see it on the back face. I want to see it just on the front face only. So I go back to the shaded mode here. I can use this deselect all faces option and pick just the front face. So now this decal that we have will show up only on that front face only. Okay. And of course, you can layer as many, I think up to 32 different decals onto the same object. You click OK button, and if I click the RenderZone button, that'll give us the full RenderZone rendering to see the full quality of how that material was then placed onto the glass material that is there using the decal tool. All right. All right, and so with that, the short presentation of FormZ RenderZone tips and tricks, you'll now be ready to apply them to your own visualization workflow. And this concludes the FormZ RenderZone tips and tricks presentation. Thanks for watching.